I had been working in the national park for over 30 years. My name is Jack, and I was an old, experienced ranger. The park had become my sanctuary, my refuge from the noise and chaos of the outside world. I knew every tree, rock, and stream by heart, but this place still held secrets that I longed to uncover. The first time I saw them, the strange white lights, they appeared over the park, dancing like fireflies in the night sky. I was on one of my regular rounds, the cool night air brushing against my face as I walked through the tall pines. I stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed the lights. They moved in a fast and disorderly manner, unlike anything I had ever seen before. I watched, captivated by their movements, until they disappeared behind the horizon. For a week, these lights appeared almost every day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I confided in my fellow rangers, asking them if they had encountered any such phenomena in other parks. Their answers only deepened my unease. These lights, they said, were not uncommon in other parks. They only appeared at night, and no one knew what they were. As the days went by, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the mystery on my shoulders. I spent my nights gazing at the sky, waiting for the lights to return. I was desperate to know the truth, and I wouldn't rest until I had found it. And so, I decided to delve deeper into the heart of the park. I set out on a cloudy morning, the air heavy with the scent of rain. The forest seemed to close in around me, the towering trees casting long shadows on the ground. I walked for hours, following the faintest of trails, until I stumbled upon a set of strange footprints. These tracks were unlike any I had ever seen, neither animal nor human. They seemed to belong to a creature that walked on two legs, but the prints were elongated, as if whatever had made them was dragging its feet. My heart raced as I followed the trail, which led me deeper into the woods. I continued on, trying to make sense of the footprints, when I came across a grisly scene. The carcass of a deer lay in front of me, its body torn apart and half-eaten. A feeling of dread washed over me, but I refused to turn back. Something had been hunting in these woods, and I needed to find out what it was. As I ventured further into the forest, I encountered more animal corpses, some of them intact, others dismembered or burned. The smell of death hung in the air, making it difficult to breathe. I couldn't help but feel as if I were being watched, as if the predator responsible for these killings was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. I pushed on, determined to uncover the truth. Eventually, I found myself in a small clearing, where the sun's rays filtered through the canopy of leaves above. The sight that greeted me was like a scene from a nightmare. The grass was scorched and blackened, and two deep pits had been dug into the ground. They were filled with animal carcasses, their lifeless bodies piled one on top of the other. I shuddered at the thought of what had transpired here. I knew that I could not leave this place until I had found some answers. As the sun began to set, I made the decision to stay in the woods for the night. I would keep watch from the edge of the clearing, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was behind these horrors. The night was cold and silent, the darkness almost suffocating. I huddled against a tree, my senses heightened, listening for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and I began to doubt whether I would see anything at all. That was when the lights appeared once more, this time over a lonely mountain in the distance. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them, their ethereal glow casting an eerie light over the forest. The lights seemed to call to me, beckoning me to come closer. With a mix of fear and determination, I decided to head in their direction, following their haunting dance across the sky. As I approached the mountain, I began to hear strange mechanical noises, like the grinding of gears or the hum of some unseen machinery. The forest seemed to tremble at the sound, and I watched as animals fled in terror, running away from the mountain and the source of the noise. My heart pounded in my chest as I continued walking, the mechanical sounds growing louder with each step. The air became thick with the smell of burning, the acrid stench of scorched earth and charred flesh. I felt as though I were walking into the heart of darkness, but I could not turn back now. Finally, I stood at the base of the mountain, my resolve unwavering. I would climb to the top, confront whatever was waiting there, and finally put an end to the terror that had gripped the park. It was a daunting task, but I had come too far to give up now. The ascent was treacherous, the rocky slopes slick with rain and hidden dangers. I climbed, muscles aching, sweat pouring down my face. I paused to catch my breath, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. But I knew I couldn't rest for long. The strange lights still danced above, drawing me ever closer to the truth. At last, I reached the summit. What I saw there defied explanation. The lights were revealed to be glowing, flying objects, their forms unlike anything I had ever seen before. They hovered above the ground, emitting a strange green gas that fell like a deadly mist, killing animals and burning the grass below. The sight was both terrifying and mesmerizing, and I could not look away. The smell of the gas was overpowering, and as it reached me, I felt my vision blur and my legs buckle beneath me. I lost consciousness, the world fading away as I succumbed to the toxic fumes. I woke up with a severe headache, and I had trouble concentrating. I tried to remember the events that had led me to this moment, but my memories were hazy, like fragments of a nightmare. I saw lights, these strange, otherworldly lights. I followed them to the top of the mountain and then darkness. As I lay there, I realized that I was no longer on top of the mountain. Instead, I found myself in a dense thicket, the ground beneath me wet. The smell of gas was gone, replaced by the earthy sense of the forest. I struggled to my feet, my limbs weak and unstable, and tried to make sense of my surroundings. I had to find a way back to the ranger station. My fellow rangers had to know what I had seen, what I had experienced. I knew it would not be easy. I was deep in the heart of the park, away from the well-trodden paths. But I was determined to return, to share my story, and warn others of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. As I trudged through the thicket, I thought of the other rangers I had talked to, those who had told their stories about the mysterious lights. I wondered if they had seen the same things I had, faced the same horrors. I knew I couldn't have been the only one who had ventured this deep into the woods. Surely others were searching for answers, trying to uncover the truth about the lights and the strange creatures that haunted the park. But why were they silent then? That was the question that kept me busy. As the sun began to set, I came across a narrow, winding path. I followed it, desperately looking for any sign of civilization, any indication that I was moving in the right direction. The path led me deeper and deeper into the forest, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive with each passing moment. After a while, I realized that I was going in the wrong direction. I was lost, in the forest I knew best. That can't be right. Why had the forest changed so much? Where was I really? I looked around. The darkness seemed to come alive, its tendrils reaching out to catch me in its cold embrace. I felt a growing unease, as if I were being watched, as if some invisible predator was hunting me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my steps echoing in the silence of the night. Suddenly I heard a voice, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. A rustle, something unknown and very large, fell a tree not far from me. I was greatly frightened and ran away. The guttural growl grew closer and louder. I ran without looking back. It was very dark, and I didn't notice the steep slope. I stumbled and rolled down quickly, hitting the damp ground and rocks. I was in a lot of pain, but I was still able to get up and look around. The growling had stopped. Apparently the creature had stopped chasing me. I decided to catch my breath and try to find a path to get out of this unfamiliar forest. I looked at the sky and it seemed strange. The stars were brighter and closer than ever. It was the first time I had ever seen such a starry sky. The strangest thing I noticed was the unnatural silence. It was like the forest was dead. There was no singing of birds, no rustling of leaves or any other sounds. I understood that I needed to remain calm and rational. I remembered that there are many signs to navigate in the woods. I started looking for signs in the trees, on the ground, in the soil, but I found nothing. Everything was the same as before, and at the same time, it was completely different. The darkness became thicker, and I realized that without a flashlight I would not see anything. I remembered that I had an LED flashlight in my pocket, so I pulled it out. I pressed a button, and the light filled my surroundings. Then I noticed that everything around me was strange. The trees were completely different than I remembered them. The leaves were irregularly shaped, and the trunks were twisted. I was very tired and decided to take a short break and gather my thoughts. My back and legs hurt, but I knew I had to keep moving. Everything around me was unfamiliar and scary, and I could not count on help or be safe. I got to my feet and walked forward, trying to find my way out of the forest. But every time I thought I had found a trail, it led me to a dead end or a dangerous section. I began to feel desperate and helpless, and I thought I would never get out of this place. Suddenly I heard the noise of branches and leaves behind me. I turned around and saw a huge animal. In the darkness it was hard to make out what it was, but it looked a lot like a bear, but it had antlers like a moose. They were big and very long. My heart raced with terror, and I knew I had to act quickly. I began to run. The unknown beast was running after me, and I could feel its breath on my back. I knew that if it caught up with me, I had to survive at all costs. I ran as fast as I could, but the beast was unstoppable. I could feel it coming toward me, and I began to panic. I was completely defenseless and didn't know what to do. Suddenly I fell and hit my head on a rock. I lost consciousness for a few minutes, and when I came to, the beast was no longer with me. I struggled to my feet and looked around. I was in a crazy forest and didn't know how long I had been unconscious. I felt a pain in my head and noticed that I had a small wound. I felt that my flashlight was lost in the chaos, and I was without light. I started looking for it, trying to remember where I could have put it. But instead of the flashlight, I came across something else. It was a backpack. I opened it and found food, water, and a compass. I was surprised and delighted to find it, but at the same time wondered who could have left it there. I began to think that I was not alone in this forest. I decided that I needed to use my compass to try to get out of the woods. I picked it up and started moving in the direction it was pointing. I walked very slowly so as not to get lost in the dark or bump into anything dangerous. I felt like I had been walking for ages, and I was sure I would never find my way out. But suddenly I saw a light. I approached it and found that it was a road. I was very happy and continued walking along the road, hoping that I would soon find help. After several hours of walking, I finally reached a small town. I was badly maimed and exhausted, but I was alive. I managed to get to the local police station, and already there I learned some shocking news. First, I was in another state, several thousand miles away from my hometown and park. Second, I was a wanted man. I had been searched for more than 2 months. Third, there was a fire in my home woods that didn't die down for weeks. The fire was put out, but some of my fellow rangers thought I might have burned. I didn't know how I ended up in a completely different state or where I had been for all those 2 months. But I realized that the fire and the mysterious beast in the woods had something to do with those glowing orbs. I decided that someday I would get to the bottom of it.
I'd never been one to shy away from a challenge. That's what led me to become a ranger in the first place. I've always been drawn to nature, to the wild and untamed. So when I received a job offer to work in a remote nature reserve, I jumped at the chance. The reserve was closed off to the public due to safety concerns, and I was told that I'd be the only ranger on site responsible for maintaining the land and conducting wildlife research. I couldn't have been more excited. The first week was bliss. I arrived at the small cabin that would be my home for the foreseeable future and settled in quickly. It was cozy, if not a little rustic. Still, I loved the solitude, the chance to immerse myself in nature without any distractions. The reserve was vast, with dense woodlands, meandering rivers, and steep cliffs. It was a place where one could easily lose themselves, both literally and figuratively. Despite my passion for the job, loneliness began to creep in. I missed human connection. I knew it was part of the deal, but I couldn't help longing for some sort of interaction. My only company was the wildlife and the occasional crackle of my walkie-talkie when I reported in to my superiors. One day, as I sat in my cabin, nursing a cup of tea and scanning over maps of the reserve, my walkie-talkie buzzed to life. Static filled the air, and then a voice broke through. "Help! Lost! Need help!" The voice was faint, barely audible above the static. I frowned, gripping the walkie-talkie tighter. No one was supposed to be in the reserve. How had they managed to get in? Regardless, I couldn't ignore a cry for help. I grabbed my jacket and backpack, ensuring I had a first aid kit, some water, and a flashlight. It would be dark soon, and I didn't want to be caught unprepared. As I trekked deeper into the reserve, I recalled the old tales I'd heard about these woods. According to legend, witches once held covens here, performing dark rituals beneath the light of the full moon. The stories always ended with a warning. Evil still lingered in these woods, waiting for unsuspecting victims to wander too close. I shook my head, trying to push the stories away from my thoughts. They were just legends. I didn't believe in witches, much less evil spirits. I was a rational person, relying on the natural world. I knew that the people who found their way into the reserve had an explanation, and it was my responsibility to find them and bring them to safety. The sun began to set, casting an eerie glow through the trees. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, focusing instead on the task at hand. I called out periodically, hoping to hear a response from the lost wanderers. My voice echoed through the woods, swallowed by the growing darkness. Then, just as the last light of day was fading, I heard a rustling in the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it the missing people, or just another woodland creature? I held my breath, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. A squirrel darted out from the bushes, chattering indignantly at me. I let out a relieved laugh, releasing the tension that had built up in my shoulders. It was just a squirrel. I was letting the darkness and the old stories get to me. I pressed on, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. The moon rose, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I switched on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the path in front of me. Every so often, I called out again, praying that I'd hear a response, some indication that I was getting closer to the lost people. But each time, my voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. I was beginning to lose hope when I stumbled upon a makeshift campsite. A fire pit, cold and abandoned, sat in the center, surrounded by discarded food wrappers and a few articles of clothing. My heart raced as I realized that this must be where the missing people had been. They couldn't be far. With renewed determination, I continued my search, following any faint sign of human passage. The woods seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I tried to remind myself that it was just my imagination, that there was nothing to fear in these woods. But the old stories refused to release their grip on my mind. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The trees here were different. Twisted and gnarled, they seemed to reach for me with their twisted limbs. The wind whispered through their leaves, a soft, sinister hissing that sounded almost like words. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the irrational fear that had taken hold. It was just the wind, and the trees had likely been shaped by centuries of weather and time. There was nothing supernatural about them. It was then that I found the first body part, a severed hand lying in a pool of congealed blood. I stumbled back in horror, bile rising in my throat. My flashlight trembled in my grip, casting erratic shadows across the gruesome scene. I wanted to turn back, to run from this nightmare and pretend I'd never seen it, but I knew I couldn't. There were still people out there, lost and terrified, and I was their only hope. I steeled myself, pushing the horror to the back of my mind and pressed onward. As I continued to search, I found more body parts scattered in the woods. Horror gripped my whole body, but I was able to overpower the fear. I had a duty to the people who had wandered into this cursed place, and I would see it through, no matter what it cost me. The woods seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as I ventured further into their depths. The wind continued to whisper through the trees, the sinister hissing growing louder, more insistent. And though I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What I saw shocked me, but I couldn't allow myself to succumb to fear. I had a mission to complete, and people's lives were at stake. Gritting my teeth, I continued my search, praying that I would find the remaining people. My breathing sounded too loud, too harsh in my ears, each exhale echoing like a scream through the darkness. I tried to focus on my task, but my thoughts kept straying to the old stories I'd heard, the whispers of ancient evil that haunted these woods. As I went deeper into the woods, I began to notice strange footprints. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, not exactly human, but not exactly animal either. The tracks led me farther and farther into the woods, and my fear grew with each step. I couldn't explain the tracks, and that frightened me. But I refused to give up, refused to abandon the lost people who depended on me. The farther I walked down the trail, the more I sensed an unsettling presence lurking beyond the edge of my vision. I caught movement, heard a faint rustling in the undergrowth. It seemed as if something was stalking me, predatorily watching my every move. Desperately trying to maintain some semblance of control, I tried to contact my superiors to inform them of what was happening. But the radio, which had been my lifeline in this desolate place, was suddenly useless. It seemed as if some evil force was actively working to keep me isolated. As I continued to search, I came across more and more gruesome evidence of the horrors that had befallen the stranded people. Body parts were strewn across the forest floor, leaving behind horrific traces of destruction that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't figure out what could have caused such carnage, but I was determined to find out. The lives of the missing people depended on it. The forest grew more ominous with each step. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, to focus on my mission, but it was getting harder and harder to deny the truth. There was something evil in this forest, something ancient and malevolent. The flashlight I'd brought with me seemed to grow dimmer, its beam barely penetrating the darkness. I knew it was probably just dead batteries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was actively working to extinguish my light and leave me at the mercy of darkness. As I moved further into the forest, the strange footprints seemed to multiply, leading me down a winding path that seemed to have no end. I tried to convince myself that I was just following the trail of an animal, that there was nothing supernatural about the tracks. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something terrible was following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The moon rose high in the sky, casting an eerie glow across the winding landscape. Shadows danced across the forest floor, their ominous outlines teasing me. The wind continued to whisper in the tree crowns, the quiet, ominous hissing sounding almost like words. As I continued my search, I came upon a small clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, blackened and charred as if by fire. The air around the circle seemed heavy. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had found something important, something to call the center of all evil in this cursed forest. The wind picked up, the hissing growing louder and more insistent. It seemed as if the darkness itself was trying to speak to me, to lure me into its ominous embrace. I fought the urge to run and forced myself to keep going, to keep searching for the missing people. I was a ranger, and it was my duty to protect those who wandered into this park. Clenching my fists, I walked forward, even though I suspected I might not find any living people. Deep into the forest, I discovered the remains of the missing people. They had been brutally murdered, their bodies dismembered and strewn about the forest like a perverted work of macabre art. Tears streamed down my face as I watched the horrible scene, but I pulled myself together with willpower. I had to get out of the place and out of the woods. As I tried to make my way out of the forest, I began to catch a glimpse of the creature that was following me. It was a monstrous, half-bear, half-human monster, its face distorted into a grotesque parody of a woman's, framed by long, tangled hair. I knew that before me was the living embodiment of one of the ancient witches. My heart pounded in my chest as I met the creature's gaze, and the horror that was building within me finally reached its limit. I tried to run, but the creature was very fast. I soon realized that I could not escape from. With a primal scream, I lunged at the creature, determined to drive it back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The witch roared with rage, swinging her massive, razor-sharp claws at me. I barely managed to dodge the blow, my heart pounding in my chest and my adrenaline rushing through my veins. I knew I couldn't face the monster. I had to find a way to outsmart him. As I struggled to stay one step ahead of the witch, a plan began to form in my head. If I could manage to trap the creature, I could get out of the forest and bring help to defeat the evil once and for all. Adopting the plan, I began to lead the witch on a desperate chase through the forest, relying on my ranger training and instincts to stay one step ahead of the beast. The darkness thickened around me, the wind howled in the trees, and I fought for my life. Finally, I reached the spot I had chosen for the trap, a deep, hidden ravine that cut through the woods. With a final burst of speed, I beckoned the witch to the edge of the chasm and dodged it at the last second, sending the creature tumbling into the depths. Gasping, I looked down into the ravine, watching as the witch thrashed and roared in fury, her monstrous form slowly consumed by the shadows below. I knew it wouldn't hold the creature forever, but it would give me the time I desperately needed to escape the woods and get help. With a heavy heart, I turned away from the abyss and began the long journey to the entrance of the sanctuary. The darkness seemed to have slightly dissipated, as if the forest reluctantly released its hold on me. The wind still whispered through the treetops, but the ominous hissing had subsided, replaced by a mournful howling that echoed through the night. As I made my way through the woods, my thoughts were consumed with the lost people who had foolishly perished at the hands of this creature. I knew I had done everything possible to save them, but the weight of their loss still weighed heavily on my heart. The journey back was long and difficult, but I refused to let fatigue and fear get the best of me. When I finally emerged from the forest and the first rays of dawn painted the sky in a pale, unearthly blue, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. Gathering a group of hunters, police officers, and other volunteers, we ventured back into the woods. However, the search yielded nothing. We found no bodies of the missing people, nor any trace of the terrible monster. Many believed that I had fabricated the whole story, but I knew that the half-bear, half-witch creature still lurked in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to strike.
I've always enjoyed the peace and solitude of my job as a ranger. Patrolling the outskirts of the gloomy forest, I'd often lose myself in the natural beauty that surrounded me. It was a chilly Friday evening when I discovered something that would change my life forever. A pale arm, sticking out of the ground, caught my eye as I walked along the edge of the woods. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, and I hesitated before moving closer to investigate. As I knelt down and began to dig, my mind raced with thoughts of what could be buried here. I tried to push my fear and anxiety aside, telling myself that it was probably just some unfortunate accident. But as I continued to uncover the cold, lifeless body, my unease only grew. I didn't have to dig far before I discovered more corpses, each one more gruesome than the last. The smell of decay filled the air, and I fought back the urge to vomit. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own, so I immediately reported the find to the FBI. I could hardly believe what I was saying as I described the scene to the agent on the other end of the line. My hands shook as I hung up the phone, and I realized that the serenity of the forest was forever tainted. When FBI Special Agent Emma arrived on the scene, I was both relieved and nervous. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman with a stern expression and a keen eye for detail. As we surveyed the area together, it was clear that there were many more bodies buried in the woods. We began the arduous task of excavating the site, trying to piece together what had happened here. The bodies seemed to have been buried for quite some time, and I couldn't help but wonder how I had never noticed anything suspicious before. As we worked side by side, Emma and I began to form a tentative bond. She shared stories of her experiences as an FBI agent, and I found myself opening up about my life as a ranger. During one of our conversations, I recalled how every Friday night, a group of people would come into the woods. They seemed harmless enough, and I had always ignored them, assuming they were just out for a late-night stroll. But now, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to their visits than I had initially thought. Emma agreed that it was worth looking into, and we decided to follow the group the next time they appeared. We had no way of knowing if they were connected to the bodies we had found, but it was a lead we couldn't ignore. So, on the following Friday, we waited in the shadows, watching as the group of people entered the forest. We trailed them at a distance, careful not to make any noise that would give us away. As we ventured deeper into the woods, we began to see that these people were not ordinary hikers. They were dressed in white robes, their faces hidden behind masks. My heart pounded in my chest as we watched them gather in a clearing, forming a circle around a large stone altar. With a sickening realization, I understood that we had stumbled upon a group of fanatics performing some sort of ritual. We watched in horror as they chanted and danced around the altar, their movements becoming more frenetic as the ritual continued. It was clear that they were preparing to make a human sacrifice, and I couldn't help but think of the bodies we had found buried in the forest. We knew we had to act quickly, so we retreated to a safe distance and called for backup. Emma's voice was steady as she explained the situation to her colleagues, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew that we were dealing with something far more sinister than we had ever encountered before. As we waited for reinforcements, we kept an eye on the fanatics, making sure they didn't become aware of our presence. But our luck didn't hold out for long. Somehow they sensed that they were being watched and quickly found our hiding spot. Before we could react, they overpowered us, dragging us out into the open. Bound and helpless, Emma and I were now hostages, and it seemed we were destined to become their next victims. The fanatics threw us to the ground near the stone altar, and I couldn't help but think of the countless others who had met their end in this very spot. Desperation and terror threatened to consume me, but I tried to focus on Emma's calm demeanor, drawing strength from her resolve. The ritual continued, and as the fanatics chanted and danced around the fire, something began to change. The air grew heavy, and a palpable sense of dread filled the clearing. I could barely believe my eyes as a demon appeared in the flames, its twisted form emerging from the fire like a living nightmare. I realized then that the world was far more complex and terrifying than I had ever imagined. Demons were real, and these fanatics had summoned one to our world. Just as the ritual was nearing its completion, the sound of approaching vehicles signaled the arrival of the FBI reinforcements. The fanatics looked up in alarm, and a fierce battle erupted in the woods. Gunshots echoed through the trees as agents fought against the white-robed believers. Still bound and lying on the ground, Emma and I struggled to break free from our restraints. We knew that we had to stop the ritual before it was completed, or the demon would be unleashed upon our world. With a surge of adrenaline, we managed to slip our bonds and join the fray. One by one, the fanatics were neutralized, either killed or captured by the FBI agents. Together, we fought against the remaining believers, our determination and cooperation helping us gain the upper hand. As we closed in on the final fanatic, I could see the fear in his eyes as he realized that his twisted plans had failed. With the ritual disrupted, the weakened demon let out an unearthly howl of rage before being forced to retreat back to its hellish dimension. The forest grew quiet once more, and the nightmarish scene began to fade. The fanatics were all arrested or killed, and the secret burial site would soon be destroyed. As we stood together in the aftermath, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Emma and the other agents who had come to our rescue. Despite the horrors we had faced, we had survived and stopped an unspeakable evil from entering our world. But as I looked into the shadows of the forest, I knew that my life would never be the same again. The veil of innocence had been lifted, revealing a dark and terrifying reality that I could never forget. The woods that had once been a sanctuary for me were now tainted by the memory of the evil buried within. It was already dark. Night had enveloped the whole world in its black shroud, including the forest where Michael and Anna, brother and sister, were walking. The siblings wanted to get out of the forest and head home, but then they realized they were lost and didn't know how to get out. They were gripped by wild fear and were seriously distressed and close to despair. However, gathering their remaining courage, Michael and Anna decided to try to find a way out after all. They stumbled around blindly, hoping that luck would smile on them and they would be able to escape. So they walked about 4 kilometers, making their way through the dark forest. Suddenly, they saw barely discernible outlines of some structure in the darkness. It was probably a house or a cabin where no one could possibly live. After discussing it between themselves, the siblings decided to spend the night in the abandoned cabin, and when it dawned, continue their search for a way out, because it would be much easier to orient themselves in the forest in daylight. The door creaked, and the siblings found themselves inside. It was dark, so Michael took out his mobile phone with a flashlight to see anything at all. The interior of the cabin resembled a typical rural house. It was obvious that it had not been inhabited for at least half a century. Useless and unnecessary items were scattered everywhere, which could hardly be of any use. Shining the light a little higher, Michael discovered a staircase leading upstairs. He made sure that there was no bed downstairs where he could lie down and finally close his eyes, sinking into blissful sleep, and decided to go up and inspect the upper floor. When he reached the top, Michael suddenly heard his phone ringing. The boy took it out of his pocket and found that the call was from an unknown number. It was unclear who was calling at such a late hour. Overcoming his excruciating fear, Michael answered the call and said, "Hello." In the receiver there was some intermittent wheezing, and then a distressing female voice said, "Get out of here. You can't be here. You will die here." And the call ended. Michael was very scared, and besides, when he looked at his call log, he found that the call was not recorded, as if no one had called. It was all very strange. Anyway, he began to calm himself down, thinking that maybe they dialed the wrong number, or some crazy prankster was randomly calling people at night and scaring them. Regaining his composure, Michael decided to continue exploring the floor. After walking a little further down the hallway, illuminating his way in the darkness, he soon discovered that there were 2 rooms on the floor. The one that was closer was locked, presumably with a key. The boy approached and pushed the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was impossible to get into the room. He went to the other room and saw that there was no door at all, and he could easily walk in, which he did. In the room, as on the first floor, there was chaos. Ripped rags and rusty tools were scattered on the floor. Strange, incomprehensible paintings hung on the walls, the content of which was difficult to discern in such darkness. In the middle of the room was what the kids needed. There was a huge, spacious bed that could comfortably accommodate at least 2 people. The bed was completely bare, with no pillows, sheets, or blankets. "Well, unfortunately, there's no choice. It seems we'll have to sleep here," Michael reasoned to himself. The boy went downstairs to his sister and said, "Let's go upstairs. There's a bed there. We'll sleep there." Turning on the flashlight on his phone, Michael saw that his sister Anna was pale and shaking, obviously frightened by something. "You know," she said, "while you were upstairs, something horrible and inexplicable happened to me. I was standing there, and suddenly I started to feel like I was in a trance. My head started spinning, and I felt like the floor was giving way beneath me. Then everything froze, and on the wall I saw a blood-red inscription, 'Get out of here before it's too late.' Then everything disappeared, and I found myself in pitch darkness again." Michael immediately remembered the strange phone call he had received, but decided to keep quiet about it for now, so as not to further disturb his already frightened sister. "Most likely you just imagined it, or your imagination got the best of you. It happens when you get too worked up. You start seeing things that don't really exist. Okay, let's go to sleep. I'm dog-tired." They went into the room with the bed, wished each other good night, and without saying another word, the brother and sister decided to finally lie down and drift off into the world of dreams. It was unsettling to sleep in such a strange and scary place. Everything was shrouded in a mysterious and eerie atmosphere. The kids lay down and started to gradually drift off to sleep, when suddenly they heard a loud, desperate scream, so clear that it was obvious that someone was screaming here in this cabin. They jumped up as if scalded, cold sweat breaking out on both their foreheads. "Did you hear that?" Michael asked Anna. "Someone was screaming. There's someone else here besides us, it seems. When we came here, I was absolutely sure that there couldn't be anyone here and that we were completely alone," Anna replied. "But you heard that scream? Who could be screaming here? Maybe we should leave here as soon as possible," Michael suggested to Anna. "I don't think we should stay here." "But where will we go?" Anna objected. "It's dark in the woods. We'll get lost no matter what. We have to wait for dawn. We won't be able to get out now, and it's even scarier to spend the night in the woods." Michael and Anna left the room and stood in the corridor for a minute, unsure of what to do next. Then Michael took out his phone and turned on the flashlight. What he saw shocked him deeply. The door to the first room, which had been locked before, was now wide open. "Sis, I think you're right. Something strange is going on in this cabin. Very strange things are happening here. That room, when I came up here, I swear to God, the door was locked tight. I even tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. And now someone has mysteriously unlocked the door. You're probably right. We need to get out of here as soon as possible," said Michael. Although the kids were very frightened, curiosity got the better of Michael, and he decided to inspect the previously locked room. Armed with his phone's flashlight, Michael stepped into the dark room. Suddenly he saw a pale hand reaching out from the darkness towards him, somehow suspended in the air. It was about to grab Michael. The boy screamed in terror and ran out of the room. "Quickly, let's run," he commanded. The kids rushed to the staircase leading to the lower floor, and at that moment a sinister laughter echoed throughout the house, and multiple voices started repeating, "You can't escape. You're here forever. Now you're doomed. Too late." Overwhelmed by wild panic, the siblings ran towards the exit with all their might. When they reached the door through which they had entered, they were horrified to find that it was now locked. Michael and Anna frantically pounded on the door with their fists, trying to open it, but it was in vain. Suddenly, the terrifying laughter mixed with a barrage of voices stopped. Michael feverishly searched the floor for a heavy object with which he could break down the door. Anna had already started having a panic attack and was relentlessly pounding on the door with her hands and feet. Suddenly, a bright white light illuminated everything, and footsteps could be heard. Someone was clearly descending the stairs towards them. After a few seconds, Michael and Anna saw a woman with long black hair. She was as pale as a sheet and looked more like a ghost than a human. But there was something even more terrifying about her. Her face was empty like a mannequin's. It had no eyes, no nose, and no mouth. The boys froze in fear, their souls sinking into their heels. What's going to happen to us now? This thought pounded fiercely and rhythmically in their brains like a drumbeat. Meanwhile, the terrifying woman began to approach the boys. When she was close, she grabbed Alina by the throat and began to strangle her. Anna tried to break free, but to no avail. Michael frantically pounded his hands on the door, hoping to break it down and open a path to freedom. He heard a stifled gasp. Someone fell to the ground. He saw his sister. She was already dead, her face frozen in an expression of immense terror. Now the terrifying woman headed towards Michael. Realizing that the door wouldn't open and escape was unlikely, the boy huddled in the corner and covered himself with his hands. The horrible, infernal creature in the guise of a woman approached closer and closer. And now it was right beside him. The woman's hands reached out and wrapped around his neck in her deadly embrace. The woman's pale, empty face, devoid of natural, structural human elements, was the last thing Michael saw in his life. His head spun, and he felt himself suffocating. After a while, in the silence of the night, there was a piercing scream that slowly turned into a stifled gasp. Finally, it too disappeared.